many videos about Mount Pinatubo. This is my story of surviving one of the worst natural disasters of the 20th century, a disaster I never saw coming. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's not my typical video, has nothing to do with the Cletus giveaway GMC. It's more of a personal story. A lot of things I've been carrying around for the last 35 years I've never really talked about from beginning to end. And yeah, it's before a lot of you guys were even around, but this goes back to 1991. I just gotten married to my first wife. The story begins more with a wedding than it does a volcano, but I was married in October of '90, and less than 2 months later I got a short notice assignment for a year unaccompanied tour at Clark Air Base, Philippines. Though I didn't really want to go, being a newlywed, you know, it's one of those things you raised your hand and said I do, and Uncle Sam didn't care about you having a wife, you know. That's just part of it. If he wanted you to have a wife, he'd issued you one. Said my goodbyes and left in February to go to the Philippines, and boy was I in for a culture shock. I left St. Louis, Missouri. It was 15 degrees. I got to Clark Air Base and it was like felt like 115 degrees. I flew into Clark directly. At that time we used to fly into Manila, but there was a terrorist threat then, and so they diverted all the incoming flights for personnel, military personnel, into Clark because of the terrorist threat. Yeah, there was a terrorist threat before I got there. There'd just been 2 airmen killed just a few months before I got there, right outside the main gate. So I did draw hazardous duty pay the whole time I was there. Little did I know then the real threat wasn't a terrorist threat. I arrived there, was in for a culture shock. I remember part of in processing, they took us off base right outside the main gate. I remember getting off the bus and I was just bombarded with little kids, I mean real young, just running up to me with their hand out wanting peso, peso, peso. And that's when I learned my first words in Tagalog. It was Elise. And that just seemed so foreign to me because that's not what you told somebody in need where I'm from. But this was far from where I grew up. This was another side of the world that I never knew existed. Yeah, I had to learn Elise, and that was the hard part. Was assigned to 3rd Law Enforcement Squadron, and there was over 1,000 law enforcement cops. After I got there, I realized why. Poverty-stricken area, theft was horrendous. There was a 28-mile perimeter we had to maintain. We had surveillance towers all over the base, all around the perimeter. We had 12-foot walls with cemented glass on top of the walls to keep intruders out. Didn't really work too well. They beat the glass off and put plywood over it, did whatever they could to get over the wall. Matter of fact, it was so bad, the surveillance towers we had, they were like 60 foot tall, and we manned them 24/7. And I remember going up to a tower, and before you went up the tower, your person you was relieving had to lower a rope with a pulley to attach to your bag and pull your bag up to the tower and then you would climb up. And then when you left, they would climb down, and then you'd have to lower their bag with the same rope with a pulley to the ground. Because if you left a bag on the ground while you were climbing up that 60-foot tower, someone would come over the wall, grab that bag, and be back over the wall. The bag was usually a bag we had to keep with us. Usually had like a flak vest, helmet, sometimes chem gear. So just typical. And then you kept your stuff you wanted to have with you on post, your snacks, drinks, whatever. That was the perimeter towers. There was also we had regular police patrols. We had several gates. There was Sotambado Gate, Negrito Gate, Dao Gate, Friendship, Main Gate, a pedestrian gate. Every gate there was an Air Force guard, a Filipino Air Force guard. We called them PAF guards. And then there was the GI. That was an agreement between the U.S. and the Philippines. They had to have one of their guards, and we had to have an American GI guard there as well. On top of all the perimeter security, we had horse patrol. We had strike force. Strike force dealt with strictly intruders and maintaining the integrity of the perimeter. We had town patrol and motorcycle patrol. Every shift had their own foot patrols through neighborhoods. So yeah, I got to see pretty quickly why there was 1,000 cops at Clark, or over 1,000. I in process the whole time I'm missing my wife. That was probably the hardest part at first, is being a newlywed and being away from my wife, but couldn't talk enough on the phone. It was too expensive to call home. As an airman, I worked the gates a lot of Sotombato Gate, Mabalocket. I think I left out Mabalocket Gate. That was when I really realized how impoverished the people around there were. Every gate we had young kids that hung out at the gate, and they would go get you anything you wanted, whether it was chicken fried rice or pork fried rice or any of the restaurants around there. Well, they actually had a KFC near there, so not too long after I was at the gate, I sent one of the gate rats out for KFC. He brought back my dinner, and usually, you would just give them a tip, a couple pesos or whatever. You never had to worry about them ripping you off, because you knew if they ripped you off, they'd never get another dime. They'd never, word get around. Nobody'd use them to get you. Sometimes you'd pay them to clean the guard shack or what have you before shift change. I had one of them go get me KFC one day, and he brought it back. I went inside the guard shack, and I kept a visual outside. There was a Filipino Air Force guard there as well. I ate my lunch and got through, put the trash, the chicken bones and everything back in a sack and put it in a garbage can. Went back outside the guard shack, and it was a few minutes later when I noticed those little kids. They were in there getting the chicken bones out of the garbage can. If you used to buy them a chicken dinner, then tomorrow there'd be 30 of them there wanting a chicken dinner. So it was sad. That's when it really struck me how impoverished they really were. And the Filipino Air Force, the PAF guards, they weren't much better. They were impoverished too. They work a lot of long hours, weeks on end, sometimes with almost no time off. It was real common. You worked the gate with them. They'd sleep on post. Matter of fact, shortly after I was there, or after I got there, one night, we were working 12-hour shifts. I was at Sotombato Gate, the Filipino Air Force guard. He had stretched out on the bench inside the guard shack. And all the guard shacks, they had glass windows. They were usually plexiglass, and then they'd have a steel wire mesh over those. It was 3:30, 4 o'clock one morning. One of the patrolmen I'd got to know pulled up at the gate, started talking a little bit, and he says, "Where's Pare?" We usually refer to him as Pare, local nationals. I just motioned in the guard shack, and he got out. He walked over to the guard shack and looked in there, and sure enough, Pare was in there asleep. And he took his hands and he pop on the screen, and I'm like, dude. I'm still new. I didn't know if maybe he knew the guard, they were friends, he was playing or whatever, but nothing happened. A few minutes later, same patrolman walked over to the guard shack, and they weren't friends, and they sure weren't friends after that. I'm standing there, and I see that PAF guard getting up, and I'm standing to the side of the door. The PAF guard walks toward the door. He's got his GAU in his hand, which is just a short-barreled M16. I'm pretty sure they're probably come from the U.S., but it was a short-barreled M16 with a collapsible stock. PAF guard woke up, lit a cigarette, and he walked to the door with a GAU at low ready, and he raised it up, chambered around, and I saw his finger flick the safety off. I thought I was fixing to witness the shooting right there. I didn't know if I was this far from drawing down on him. It was one of those situations I've never been in before. He stood there for a second with the GAU pointed like this, halfway toward the ground and halfway toward the airman who was standing directly in front of the guard shack. That few seconds he stood there with that GU felt like an eternity. I get chills now thinking about how close I was right there to witness a shooting and maybe being involved in one. Luckily, he flicked the safety back on, turned around and walked back in the guard shack, and I wanted to grab that. He was a senior airman, I can't remember his name, but I wanted to grab him by his throat. I was pissed. Needless to say, he didn't come around me much anymore. One time, not too long after I was in country, I was at Doe Gate, and I remember sitting outside the guard shack. All these guard shacks, they had like plexiglass windows and steel screens around the windows, sandbags all around, like something out of a Vietnam movie. For some reason, it got real quiet all of a sudden. There I went to diving. And then I looked and I saw the Filipino Air Force, the PAF guard behind me. He was looking down at me, just laughing, just doubled over laughing. That was my introduction to Filipino fireworks. They're not regulated there like they are here. What I heard is what they called 5 stars. I could go on for hours with different stories. We had static posts everywhere. And we had posts at DRMO was a junkyard. We had to have somebody there to watch because if not, local nationals would come in the junkyard and steal anything they could for scrap. Cold storage, we had a post there. We had a FEN tower, which Far East Network broadcasting tower. They'd steal the metal off the tower if we didn't have a guard there. So just a post out in the middle of nowhere, we'd have to have a GI there. Cost of everything was pretty cheap over there. At the time, I think the exchange rate was 28 pesos to the dollar. I'm learning the culture, I'm learning the job, and then all of a sudden I start hearing talk about Mount Pinatubo. It was a volcano. It had been dormant for, I don't know, some say 500-600 years. One year I'm over there on an unaccompanied tour, it's going to become active. But I remember our flight chief at Guard Mount talking about volcanologist. I remember we were joking about being Dr. Spock. We weren't laughing long. We started smelling the sulfur. I've got pictures of Mount Pinatubo, see the steam coming out of it. I can still remember that smell. And on the one side of the picture was the elephant cage. This was in the early 90s, so the Cold War was pretty much over. But back in the day, that elephant cage was used for intelligence gathering. We used to monitor the Soviet communication through the elephant cage. We're hearing more and more about the Mount Pinatubo and the gases all the time. It finally come to a head. Everybody was talking about it. You know, there's plenty of people monitoring it, measuring the seismic activity and the ground shaking and all that. But we had more and more gases coming up. We could smell it. Eventually, the Pacific Air Force's commander, I believe it's General Studer, I believe he's 2-star general. He actually traveled to the volcano on a helicopter. They'd come to the conclusion, they weren't 100%, but they had a pretty good idea that it was going to blow. June 10th, he made the decision to evacuate 15,000 troops from Clark, military personnel and their dependents. They evacuated, leaving a skeleton force there of mission essential people, basically security. We all stayed behind while everyone else was being evacuated. Non-mission essential personnel were leaving Clark and going to Subic Bay, the dependents and the military personnel. When they went to Subic Bay, the intruder problem didn't go away. It got worse. Seeing as the base housing and a big part of the base was like a ghost town, there was nothing there but security forces. They were coming over the wall, stealing left and right. It was all we could do to keep the intruders off the base, breaking in houses and stealing things. That was June 10th is when they evacuated. Of course, we went into 12-hour shifts. I remember working nights. I went to work one night, come home, got off in the morning, got to bed, I guess around 8 o'clock. I was laying there in bed, sound asleep. It was the morning of June 12th, and I heard bam, 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 bam on my door. Scared me to death. I jumped up and opened the door, and my room boy was there. I couldn't understand a word he was saying. He's speaking Tagalog. And then I did understand one word, volcano. I'm throwing clothes on, shoes, and I'm grabbing my bag and I'm running for the door. I jump in one of the buses that was staged outside the barracks, and I'm sitting there waiting to, it wasn't long before the bus was full. We started to leave, and where's the key? Where's the key? You can't make this up. Nobody had the key to the bus. These buses were staged outside the barracks, and nobody knew where the key was. I had done looked up in the sky and saw a gigantic plume, just a straight column up. Later, they said that column went 15 miles in the air. It was just like larger than life right there in front of you. And then to get on the bus and no keys, yeah, I was in a straight up panic. Everybody jumped off the bus and took off running. It was every man for themselves. Well, our barracks was right across the street from the armory. I ran over. All the armory guys were throwing weapons in the van, kind of like a UPS package van. They were just throwing munitions, weapons, packing it full. I helped them. They all jumped in the back. I jumped over on the passenger side. And I remember tearing out of the armory, loaded down with people, weapons, munitions, and we were flying toward the gate, furthest gate from the volcano. And we're all steadily looking up in the sky, and we're scared to death. We're running. The driver's driving like a madman. He's going around Friendship Highway straight toward the main gate, and there was a little bend in the road. He was flying. He was going too fast. He'd come around the bend, and I swear my life flashed before my eyes. I thought I was scared of the volcano. I was scared I was going to die on that van. I felt the wheels come off the ground. It almost tumped over in that curve. It would have killed all of us. Everybody was panicking. Anyway, that didn't kill us. We made it through. We got outside the gate. And of course, we were in Angeles City, and everybody in Angeles City was panicking too, trying to get away from there. We come up to an intersection. Of course, it was traffic jam everywhere. Jeepneys, trikes, you name it. If it had wheels on it, it was headed away from there. Pulling up to an intersection, like I said, I was in the passenger seat, and we pull up, and I'm sitting there with with the M16. I'm in civilian clothes, looking around, because I'm thinking terrorist threat still. I hadn't spent much time off the base at that time. Saw a couple guys coming up to the van on the passenger side where I was sitting. And I said, Hinde, Elise. They were coming anyway. And I raised up my M16. And I chambered around right there. I can still hear the sound of that cartridge going in the chamber. That stopped them. I didn't know if they were New People's Army. Luckily, even though that first eruption was so powerful it shot ash 15 miles in the air, we were relatively unaffected at the base, so we returned not too long after we left. Kind of felt like we'd dodged a bullet, but little did we know. The big one was yet to come. And we got word that, that might not be it. The volcano is still spewing ash. You could smell it really strong. This went on for several days. We were getting small eruptions. We were running from the volcano just one morning after another. It'd burp a little bit. We were up and running. Earthquakes, tremors weren't too bad at that point. They were happening nonetheless. Like I said, every time that volcano belched, we were up and running. So we spent about 3 days pretty much no rest. Every time you tried to get some sleep, we'd go running for the bus, and then it'd be a false alarm. We'd go back. Then it'd be time for you to go back to work. So we were all working around the clock. This went on for a good while, and every time the alarms went off and we ran from the volcano, it's like the intruders knew we were running. And that's when they'd come over the wall. So we'd be chasing intruders 1 minute and running from the volcano the next. It went on for about 3 days. I was doing a foot patrol, and I wish I could remember the sergeant's name. We were on foot patrol together in the Mabalocket housing area, which is the gate closest to Mount Pinatubo. It got to be early morning hours. We wouldn't normally have access to a vehicle. Foot patrol, you were waiting for a patrol to come pick you up. Your shift was over, you'd rendezvous at a location for pickup. Well, luckily, this buck sergeant had a car of his own, so we were able to take his vehicle out in the Mabalacat area, so we had a way to get away. And to this day, I'm eternally grateful that I was in that situation and I was actually with somebody who had a car. That morning, I don't know what time it was, but I remember the alarm going off, and this time it wasn't a false alarm. I remember the ground shaking, hearing the noise, and just the most powerful explosion you could ever imagine. And we knew this time it wasn't, it was the real deal. I remember seeing the ash in the cloud, and it was just surreal. It was right there in front of me, and it looked like it was coming directly toward me. He was driving like a madman as well, flying through base housing. We evacuated, and there was a Panga Agricultural College, I believe it was. It's like a blur. I can't remember the drive there, but I remember being there. And what was crazy, Hollywood could not have wrote this scene any better. At the same time the volcano erupted, there was a typhoon, Typhoon Yuma. The typhoon hit the same time the volcano erupted. So now ash and rock was falling out of the sky. I remember it being 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was darker than any night you can imagine. There was absolutely no sunlight. Rain was falling out of the sky. The rain was mixing with the ash. I remember scraping it out of my eye so I could see. I was carrying an M16 and my Beretta. We all just carried as many weapons as we could with us. I remember the rock, the mud falling from the sky in my eyes, all over my skin. I could smell the smell just like it was yesterday. This mixture of sulfur, the rain from the typhoon. We made it to the college. Somebody assigned me to a traffic control point right there at the front of the college. And we weren't the only ones evacuating to the college. A lot of local nationals and people in the vicinity also were evacuating there. And I remember the earthquakes were absolutely horrible. I'd never felt an earthquake. The ground was shaking beneath me. I remember a tree limb falling behind me. There was trees right behind the agricultural college sign, and I remember hearing one of them fall, and I heard someone yell. Like I said, it was pitch black. A limb had fell on a little girl and had her pinned, but it wasn't bad. I'm thinking, man, how close was that? That could have been really bad. Finally, the traffic died down enough. I went back to a makeshift camp where we had rendezvoused in flights, and I believe I was in B flight at the time. Finally, it was like such a relief. The volcano had erupted and we were still alive, but the earthquakes were horrible. The rain, the sludge was falling from the sky. The roofs were filling up. Earthquakes were shaking the buildings. They were older buildings. I remember having to decide, go inside to rest and take a chance on the building falling in, or stay outside the building with the ash and the rain coming out of the sky. I think I did a little of both. I get scared being inside the building because the ground was shaking so bad. Then I go outside and I was just covered with rain and ash. It didn't matter at this point. I had so much ash and mud and stuff on me. I remember our weapons. We were really concerned about our weapons. The ash dried them out. Berettas would not cycle. They'd get so filthy just being in your holster. M16, same way, but I think the Berettas were even worse. They were always extremely dry. So we had We had a few people, that's all they did. It's just constantly clean weapons, clean weapons. 5 minutes outside in the ash, it's just as dirty as it was before it was cleaned. We wound up staying at the college. I was only there a day. Then somebody made the decision that we were going back to Clark. We had heard all kinds of rumors. We heard that New People's Army and the Filipino Air Force were actually having firefights, fighting over Clark Air Base. Of course, we didn't have any power. We had no water. The only water we had at the college or at the base, the only water we had come from water buffaloes from the fire department. The only food we had was MREs. Felt like no support. We were left alone. They had done evacuated 15,000 people, and we were a skeleton crew. We went back to the base the next day. I do remember passing villages and seeing their huts covered. The ground that used to be valleys was just flat from the ash, and you could see the pyroclastic flows where they had come down, and it washed out bridges, washed out road, it washed out houses. Luckily, when we got back to the base, the rumors about the Filipino Air Force and the New People's Army firefights and all that, it wasn't true. The base was in shambles. Just like up at the college, they had buildings falling in. I got back to Clark. It was unbelievable. It was like a disaster zone. The buildings had accumulated feet of water and ash on top of the buildings, and then the earthquakes were happening and buildings were collapsing everywhere. The earthquakes went on for days and weeks to come. Still no water and very little food, no services. Going back to the barracks, I just knew our barracks would be overrun and everything I had in the barracks would be gone, but no, the barracks, at least our barracks, was untouched. Of course, we resumed security in the perimeter of the base. Of course, we still had a lot of trouble with intruders. We shoveled ash for weeks on end to keep them from collapsing. Still wasn't sure that was going to work because the earthquakes were still so violent. I remember laying in bed, jumping up and running out, and I noticed I was the only one running out of the barracks. That's when I asked people, did you not feel that? Did you not feel that? No. So I was imagining earthquakes that weren't happening. And for a long time, like I said, we didn't have power. We didn't have water. I remember once we got back into the barracks, first sergeant called a meeting, everybody in the barracks. He had us come to the latrine. They had these 55-gallon garbage cans they would fill with water. And I remember him calling us all in there, chewing our asses over using that water for hygiene. People were using it to wash their hair, wash their body, taking sponge baths with it. But that water was to be used for flushing the toilets only. And I remember him threatening us that that was all the water we had was to be used for flushing the toilets and flushing the toilets only. If he caught one more person using that water for anything other than flushing the toilet, he would have us all living in a tent city. Clark Air Base was 9 short miles from Mount Pinatubo. When the people were evacuated from Clark, a lot of them thought they were coming back. A lot of them left their animals, their pets behind, refrigerators full of food. And when we come back to the base, it was weeks before many of those houses were gone into. There was animals left behind that were aggressive. They were starving. A lot of them had to be euthanized. That was one of the hardest parts for me. I remember the stench. I remember the stench from those rotten refrigerators. Power had been out for weeks. That smell was horrific. You could smell it from the street. We lived in these conditions for quite a while, and we would still get a lot of eruptions. Remember the base car lot. AFES actually had a car lot there, and the mud flows had actually relocated the new car lot across the street. So the new car lot looked like a junkyard. The BX roof had collapsed. Our old law enforcement desk we were using, the roof had collapsed on it, so we didn't use that anymore. And we moved to the officers club and used it as a command post, I guess, for all of the law enforcement flights. Still, we worked 12-hour days for a long time. Static post out in the middle of nowhere. I remember we worked so many nights straight, 12, 14 hours. If somebody come to relieve you, sometimes you get stuck out there and figure you just forgot about. It was just total chaos. One night, it was like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning. Somebody keyed up on the radio, "I'm going crazy out here." Desk sergeant keyed up, said, "Last caller, repeat." Said again on the radio, "I'm going crazy out here." The desk sergeant keyed up, "Last caller, your location and call sign." Guy didn't miss a beat, keyed up again, "Not that fucking crazy." I laughed till I cried. Eventually, they were having these R&R trips it was near Camp Wallace, a place called La Union. It was a tropical paradise. It was beautiful. It was right there on the South China Sea, sandy beaches, swimming pool, floating bar. And I remember deep sea fishing. Me and another guy, he's a buck sergeant, we had decided to split the cost for a deep sea fishing trip. And he rounded up the guide. And I remember going out there on this wooden boat. I don't know, could have been more than probably a 10, 12-foot boat maybe. We were all three on it. It's motorized. It was a small boat for such a big ocean, but we were going deep sea fishing. And I remember him taking us out there, and we got out a pretty good ways. You couldn't see the shore anymore. Pretty soon, he got out one glove from my right hand, and he pulled out some thin rope and a big hook, probably this long. And then he pulled out a bait fish, and the fish was probably this long. And I'm thinking myself, man, that's bait. I'd be happy catching that. Anyway, he cut it up, put it on the hook, cut it where it would go naturally through the water. And he gave me the rope, and he told me to tie it around my hand on that glove. He took off trolling and threw the fish out, and I felt the tension. I felt the tension of the line and that bait fish, and it was a lot of tension. And he's trolling along, I don't know, felt like he was getting down pretty good. I'm thinking, whatever's underneath this boat is tied to me, but I'm not tied to this boat. And I'm thinking, it's tied to my hand pretty good. Anyway, this is all going through my mind as well. But I felt the tug on that line, the tension, and I said, "Pare," I said, "how am I going to tell if I get a bite?" And I remember him saying, "Oh, Pare, you'll know. And it probably wasn't in the water for less than a minute, and I felt the biggest pull you could imagine. And the fight was on. I pulled, and I had one. And man, he was pulling probably 10 to 15 seconds, and he broke the line and got away. And I don't know to this day who's happier, me or him. And I remember the buck sergeant I was with. I can't remember his name either. It was his turn now. I'm good. So deep sea fishing wasn't that good an idea anymore. And I can't say as I blame him, because if that rope was any stronger, he'd have taken me out of the boat. And that was my first experience deep sea fishing. But I really needed that. I needed that stress relief. The more I tell these stories, the more memories come back to me. For instance, a few weeks after we returned to Clark, we were riding in a deuce and a half that was being used as a troop carrier to take us out to our post. Another layer of ash had fallen overnight, and a light rain had turned the roads into something like grease. The driver came into a corner way too fast over by the parade ground. That heavy deuce and a half lost traction and started sliding. Before we knew it, it had spun a full 180 degrees. I remember feeling one side of the truck lift as the wheels came off the ground. Then it slammed back down onto the pavement when the tires hit a curb. To this day, I don't know why that deuce and a half didn't roll over. It could have ended very differently. As time went on, finally the U.S. and the Philippines come to an agreement. The base agreement was ending, I should say, and Clark was going to be shut down. Well, all those people that had been evacuated, most of them thought when they were leaving to come back, and they didn't. It was a script you couldn't have wrote if you were in Hollywood. You hear a lot of videos, people talking about how far the ash went, and it was the most powerful volcano in so many years. I don't know about any of that. All I know what it was like to feel the ground shake underneath you and see the ash coming towards you and thinking you were going to die. That was what I knew about the volcano. They decided to close Clark Air Base. Then we had the task of getting all those people's belongings out of all those houses packed up. Those military members that left went everywhere. After there was some sense of normalcy, then I went to work in customs. They were Filipino contractors. They'd show up at a house in the morning with several plywood crates. I had to go through their stuff that was left behind and decide what to ship and what not to ship. And I had to overwatch all the local nationals pack up the military members' personal goods. And there's no telling how much stuff of those people's was stolen. I know it's probably not fair, and it's not a reflection on the whole country. It's just a different culture. Definitely an experience I'll never forget. We were the last Americans ever assigned to Clark Air Base. We formally turned over Clark Air Base to the Filipino government on November 26, 1991, after the PI Senate rejected the new bases agreement. After 90 years of U.S. military presence, we were leaving. Subic Bay was gone not quite a year later in 1992. To this day, I can still smell the sulfur. I can still remember the earthquakes. I can still see the wall of ash coming toward us. It wasn't about watching a volcano erupt. It was about watching your world change overnight and still trying to do your job. 35 years since I walked out of Clark Air Base, and a year later I separated the Air Force for civilian life. I remember pulling up to the gate, Memphis International Airport, looking through the windows in the aircraft into the terminal and seeing my wife, my brother, my mom and dad standing there waiting for me. And after everything we'd been through, there were times I honestly wasn't sure I'd ever see home again. Sitting here today, 35 years later, mom and dad are both gone. I don't think I ever told them how much seeing them there waiting for me at the gate actually meant to me. Now they're both gone, and I'd like to think they're still waiting for me. I made this video pretty much just to preserve the memories. If you served at Clark Air Base during those days, thank you. We shared something very few people will ever understand. If you watched because you wondered what it was really like, I hope I answered that question. I've kept this buried for 35 years. Today I finally brought it home. Thanks for watching.